so important when we're talking. Welcome to this lecture about public key cryptography. And you will see why this knowledge is so important when we're talking about blockchain very soon. Because you might have heard that you send transactions in Bitcoin and that these transactions need to be signed by your private key. But you never really understood what a private key is, and you don't really know what a public key is. Well, in this lecture you're going to know all about that. So let's get into it. First of all, we have to understand that public key cryptography has several use cases. And so one of the use cases is here in blue. It is encryption, namely how we can send data between different parties on an unsecured network. So for example, you are in one city, I'm in another city, and I want to send a message to you through the internet. But the internet is a public network. I don't really trust the internet when it comes to sending secret messages, so how can I send a message to you? So encryption is one use case. Another use case is digital signatures, and digital signatures is what is used in blockchain in order to sign transactions. So for example, in Bitcoin we use our private keys in order to sign transactions before the transactions are broadcasted on the public network. And digital signatures do not encrypt the message. They only validate the sender, so that I can digitally sign a document or I can digitally sign a transaction, and the other people can then verify that it was indeed me who signed the transaction or me who signed the document. So let's take a closer look and start with the first use case, encryption. And this one is not really used in Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in the way that we're going to talk about it, but it is very important to know just as general knowledge. So encryption. How do you communicate data between each other on an unsecured network? So for example, on the internet. Well, you use public and private keys. This is a standard nowadays, that we use public and private keys if we want to send something that is truly secure. And in order to generate a private key, you just need a large random number, and then your computer can generate this private key. And so your computer will find this large random number, generate the private key, and from the public key it will generate the public key. So random number that generates the private key, and then using that private key the computer can generate the public key. So each private key has a public key paired together. So all public and private keys come in pairs. Each public key is paired to a private key. And so when you have generated your public and private keys, public is what you share publicly. You share it to the world. You share it on the internet. You tell it to your grandmother. You tell it to your mother-in-law. You tell everyone your public key. You tell everyone your public key. And your private key is what you keep secretly. You should never ever reveal your private key to anyone. And you start to recognize the narrative from cryptocurrencies that your private key is what is your most what should be kept privately, because it's very important so that only you have the private key. Why is that? Let's check the situation a bit more. So for example, when we have this situation that Bob wants to send a message to Alice through an unsecured network, a very public, and you don't know who looks at the network, who is in the network. You do not want anyone to know what you're saying to Alice. You do not want anyone to know what you're saying to Alice. So what you do is that you use Alice's public key and encrypt the message. So the message here is "Hello Alice." You use Alice's public key and encrypt it. Because, as you remember, public key is shared publicly. Alice has published her public key on the internet. So you can take a message and encrypt it and get this encrypted message right here that no one can read now. And only Alice can use her private key to decrypt the message. And only this private key can decrypt the message. Nothing else can decrypt the message, only Alice's private key. And now you see why private key should be kept privately. Because Private key can decrypt all messages that are encrypted with the public key. That this, if these two keys are a pair, you remember we talked about that public and private keys go in pairs. So the public key in the pair can encrypt messages and private key in the pair can decrypt messages. And so this is how encryption works with public and private keys. Now, how about digital signatures? So for example, in Bitcoin, we use digital signatures to sign transactions. You use your private key to sign a transaction that is then broadcasted on the network, publicly on the network. And when you sign a transaction, it's not that you encrypt a transaction. You just sign it and everyone on the network can check who signed it. And everyone will know that you signed it. So you ensure the identity of the sender by having digital signatures. And how do I do that? Well, if I get a message that is signed by a private key, I can use the private key of the sender to I can use the public key of the sender to verify that it was sent using the private key of the sender. And so in that sense, we provide identity of the sender. Everyone can verify who sent the message. And this is very important because this is what is used in cryptocurrencies. And if you lose your private key, it will mean that someone else will be able to sign your transactions. And suddenly the network will think that you are signing transactions because your private key is what identifies you when you sign something with that private key. And you show that thing you just signed to the world. Everyone will think that you signed this data or this transaction. So extremely important to keep private keys private, and they are called private for a reason. So I hope you understand the two different use cases of public key cryptography. One use case is encryption, that you can send messages through the internet. This use case is not really used in Bitcoin that much, but digital signatures is what is used a lot. And simply put, you use your private key to sign a message, and everyone else on the network, when they see the message, they will be able to confidently say that you signed the message, because this is how digital signatures work. I hope you learned something, guys. I hope you know what a public key is, what a private key is, why private keys should always be kept privately, and I'll see you in the next lecture.